On February 25, 1956, in a closed session of the 20th Party Congress in Moscow, First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev stood before communist delegates and did something unthinkable. For 4 hours, he spoke of crimes, purges, and terror committed by the man millions still mourned as their savior. Joseph Stalin, dead for nearly 3 years, was being dismantled word by word. The speech was secret, meant only for party ears, but within days, whispers spread across the Soviet Union. Factory workers gathered at locked rooms to hear it read aloud. Students debated in dormitories late into the night. A woman in Leningrad wrote in her diary, "They say Comrade Khrushchev spoke of terrible things. I cannot believe it. I will not." Yet across the nation, a question began to form in millions of minds. What if everything we believed was a lie? This is the story of how an empire built on worship confronted the truth about its God. If this history grips you, subscribe for more untold stories. Like if you want to see the evidence. Comment what shocks you most. Now let's uncover what happened when belief collapsed. On March 5, 1953, the Soviet radio announced that Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin had died. Across 11 time zones, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Millions wept openly in the streets. In Moscow, crowds surged toward the Hall of Columns where his body lay in state, crushing hundreds to death in their desperation to see him one last time. A schoolgirl in Kiev wrote, "Stalin is no more. I cannot do anything. Everything falls apart," crying all the time. In factories, workers collapsed at their benches. An adult in Moscow confessed to his diary, "This is the end. The Americans are going to conquer us." For decades, Stalin had been more than a leader. He was the father of nations, the genius of mankind, the man who defeated fascism and built socialism from the ruins of Tsarist Russia. His portrait hung in every classroom, every office, every home. Children were taught to thank Comrade Stalin before they thanked their parents. A teacher in Minsk described the scene in her school assembly. "They herded us into the hall, ordered us to kneel, and the party secretary screamed from the stage, 'Weep, children, weep! Stalin has died!' And she wailed like her soul had been torn out." The grief was genuine, but it was also engineered. For 25 years, the Soviet propaganda machine had constructed a cult of personality so total that citizens could not imagine life without him. Newspapers praised his wisdom daily. Poets wrote odes to his kindness. Films depicted him as a gentle, all-knowing father figure who worked tirelessly for his people. Even in private letters, citizens praised Stalin with language that bordered on religious devotion. A soldier returning from the war wrote to his wife, "We owe everything to our great leader. Without him, we are nothing." The state encouraged this worship because it served a purpose. In a vast, multi-ethnic empire scarred by revolution, civil war, and invasion, Stalin's image provided unity and legitimacy. If the people believed in Stalin, they believed in the system. But beneath the adoration lay something darker. Millions had disappeared during the Great Terror of the 1930s. Neighbors vanished in the night. Family members were arrested without explanation, sent to labor camps in Siberia, or executed as enemies of the state. Yet the propaganda insisted these were traitors, spies, saboteurs working for foreign powers. And because Stalin said so, people believed it, or at least they pretended to. A factory foreman in Sverdlovsk later admitted, "We heard the arrests, we saw the empty chairs at work, but we told ourselves they must have been guilty. The alternative was too terrible to consider." Fear and faith became inseparable. To doubt Stalin was to doubt everything. So when he died, the Soviet people did not feel liberated, they felt orphaned.
After Stalin's death, a collective leadership emerged. Georgy Malenkov became premier, Lavrenti Beria controlled the secret police, and Nikita Khrushchev served as first secretary of the Communist Party. For 3 years, the new leaders carefully dismantled Stalin's most oppressive mechanisms. The gulags began releasing prisoners. The pervasive atmosphere of terror eased slightly. But publicly, Stalin's legacy remained untouchable. Then came the 20th Party Congress in February 1956. On the final night, delegates were told to remain for a closed session. What followed would shatter the foundation of Soviet belief. Khrushchev took the podium and began to speak. His words were measured at first, but soon they turned devastating. He detailed Stalin's crimes methodically: the fabricated charges against loyal communists during the purges, the torture used to extract false confessions, the mass executions of innocent party members, the deportations of entire ethnic groups, Stalin's catastrophic military blunders during World War II that cost millions of lives, his paralysis and cowardice when the Nazis invaded. Khrushchev revealed that of 139 Central Committee members elected in 1934, 98 had been arrested and shot, most on baseless accusations. He read letters from condemned men begging for their lives, proclaiming their innocence to the end. The audience sat frozen. Some delegates wept, others stared ahead in shock. A witness later recalled, "You could hear breathing, nothing else, just the sound of 1,500 people trying to comprehend the incomprehensible." Reports from that night describe heart attacks among listeners. At least 2 delegates were carried out unconscious. In the days that followed, some committed suicide, unable to reconcile what they had heard with the lives they had lived. The speech was secret, intended only for the party elite. But secrecy in the Soviet Union was never absolute. Khrushchev authorized the text to be read at closed party meetings across the country. Within weeks, factory cells, university groups, and military units gathered to hear the words. The reactions were explosive. A student in Moscow wrote, "They told us Stalin was a hero. Now they say he was a murderer. Who do we believe? What do we believe?" In Georgia, Stalin's birthplace, the revelations sparked riots. Crowds poured into the streets of Tbilisi, demanding that Khrushchev retract his lies. Soviet troops crushed the protests violently, killing dozens. But the unrest revealed a deeper truth. For many, the cult of Stalin was too deeply rooted to abandon overnight. Yet for millions of others, the speech unleashed years of suppressed doubt. A woman in Leningrad confessed to her diary, "I always wondered why my uncle never returned from 1937. They told us he betrayed the motherland. Now I see he was only one of millions. How do I live with this knowledge?"
The secret speech did not reach the Soviet public through official channels. Instead, it spread like a virus, whispered in kitchens, discussed in hushed tones on factory floors, debated late into the night in student dormitories. The government never published the full text, but typed copies circulated secretly. People memorized passages and repeated them to friends. The CIA obtained a copy and broadcast excerpts over Radio Free Europe, ensuring that even those outside party circles heard fragments of the truth. The psychological impact was profound. Soviet citizens had been raised to see the world in absolutes. The party was always right. Stalin was infallible. The enemies of the state deserved their fate. Now, those certainties crumbled. A teacher in Kharkov described the confusion in her classroom. The students asked me if it was true, if Stalin had killed innocent people. I did not know what to say. For years I taught them to honor his name. Now I am told he was a tyrant? How do I explain this? Families confronted painful truths. A young man in Siberia discovered that his father, executed in 1938 as a Japanese spy, had been innocent. For 18 years, he had carried the shame of being the son of an enemy. Now the state quietly rehabilitated his father's name, issuing a brief notice that the charges had been false. No apology, no explanation, just a bureaucratic reversal. He wrote to a friend, "They stole my father. They stole my childhood, And now they hand me a paper and expect me to move on? I feel nothing but rage. Across the Soviet Union, similar stories emerged. Wives learned their husbands had not been traitors. Children discovered their parents had not abandoned them, but had been taken. The rehabilitation process began slowly, releasing some prisoners from the camps and expunging criminal records. But it was chaotic and incomplete. Many files had been destroyed. Officials who had participated in the purges now controlled the rehabilitation process, creating layers of denial and obstruction. The intellectual class reacted with a mixture of relief and fury. Writers and poets who had survived by self-censorship began to push boundaries. Magazines published stories that hinted at the suffering of the Gulag. Ilya Ehrenberg's novel, The Thaw, gave the era its name, a cautious warning after decades of frozen silence. But the thaw was fragile. Khrushchev himself was inconsistent. He condemned Stalin's terror, but defended the communist system. He allowed some freedoms, but crushed dissent when it threatened party control. A journalist in Moscow captured the contradiction. We are told to speak the truth about the past, but not too loudly. We can question Stalin, but not Lenin. We can mourn the victims, but not blame the system that created them. It is liberation with limits. This ambiguity left many citizens in limbo, unsure how much honesty was safe. Conversations about Stalin still carried risk. Informants remained active. The KGB, though weakened, still monitored dissent. A worker in Sverdlovsk wrote, "We talk more freely now, but we still look over our shoulders." Yet the change was irreversible. Once the truth had been spoken aloud, it could not be unspoken. A generation raised on certainty now lived in doubt, and that doubt would shape the Soviet Union's future in ways Khrushchev never intended.
The revelations of 1956 created a fracture that ran through Soviet society, dividing not just opinions, but generations. For those who had lived through the terror, Khrushchev's speech was both a release and a torment. A woman in Moscow who had lost her husband in the purges wrote, "For 18 years I told myself he must have been guilty. It was the only way to survive. Now they tell me he was innocent, and I must live with the knowledge that I doubted him." Survivors of the Gulag, returning home after years in labor camps, found a country that did not know how to receive them. Their families had been taught to view them as enemies. Neighbors avoided them. Even official rehabilitation did not erase the stigma. A man released from Kolyma in 1956 described his return. "My mother wept when she saw me, but my brother would not speak to me. He said I had shamed the family. I tried to tell him I was innocent, but he had believed the lie for so long he could not accept the truth." For the older generation, those who had built their identities around Stalin's leadership, the speech was an existential crisis. A retired factory director in Leningrad confessed to his diary, "I gave my life to the party. I reported saboteurs. I enforced quotas. I believed we were building paradise. Now I am told I was part of a machine of murder. What was it all for?" Many of these individuals could not reconcile the revelation with their past actions. Denial became a form of self-preservation. They clung to the belief that Khrushchev was exaggerating, that the West was distorting the truth, that Stalin's achievements outweighed his crimes. But the younger generation responded differently. Students born during or after the war had no personal memory of Stalin as a living leader. For them, the revelations were shocking but also liberating. A university student in Moscow wrote, "My father still defends Stalin. He says Khrushchev is a traitor. But I read the speech and I see clearly, we were lied to. The question is not whether to believe it, but what to do with the truth." This generational divide sparked intense debates. In universities, students organized discussion groups to analyze the speech and its implications. They questioned not just Stalin, but the entire Soviet narrative. If the party had lied about Stalin, what else had it lied about? If the purges were unjust, what about collectivization? What about the war? What about the promise of communism itself? The authorities watched nervously. Khrushchev had hoped the speech would strengthen the party by distancing itself from Stalin's excesses. Instead, it unleashed a wave of critical thinking that extended beyond Stalin to the system itself. In Poland and Hungary, the revelations contributed to uprisings in 1956.
Soviet tanks crushed the Hungarian Revolution, killing thousands. The message was clear. You could question Stalin, but you could not question Soviet power. Back in the USSR, writers tested the boundaries. Boris Pasternak's novel, Dr. Zhivago, which portrayed the revolution's human cost, was banned in the Soviet Union but published abroad. Alexander Solzhenitsyn began writing One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, a stark account of life in the Gulag. When it was published in 1962 with Khrushchev's approval, it became a sensation, selling millions of copies. Readers saw their own suffering reflected on the page. Yet the state's tolerance was limited. By the mid-1960s, the thaw began to freeze again. Khrushchev was ousted in 1964, and his successors clamped down on dissent. The truth about Stalin had been spoken, but it would not be fully confronted for another generation. Still, something had shifted. An engineer in Sverdlovsk wrote in 1965, "They can forbid the books and silence the debates, but they cannot erase what we now know. My children will grow up with questions their grandparents never dared to ask."
By the late 1950s, Soviet citizens had entered a strange new reality. The man they had worshipped was now condemned. The crimes they had ignored were now acknowledged, if only partially. Yet the system that had enabled those crimes remained in power, and many of the men who had carried them out still held positions of authority. This created a pervasive sense of cognitive dissonance. In workplaces across the Soviet Union, former NKVD interrogators sat alongside the relatives of their victims. A clerk in Minsk wrote, "The man who arrested my father in 1937 works in the same building as me. We pass each other in the hallway. He nods. I say nothing. What am I supposed to do? Confront him? Report him? To whom?" The rehabilitation process, while significant, was incomplete and unsatisfying. Of the millions arrested during the terror, only a fraction were officially exonerated. Many files remained classified. Families seeking information about lost relatives received vague responses or outright lies. The bureaucracy that had condemned them now controlled their redemption. A widow searching for her husband's records was told, "The file has been lost. There is nothing more we can do." She wrote bitterly, "They erased him twice, once when they killed him, and again when they lost his name." Soviet society developed a split consciousness. Publicly, citizens participated in state rituals, attended party meetings, and repeated official slogans. Privately, they harbored doubts, shared forbidden stories, and questioned the narratives they had been taught. This duality became a survival mechanism. A journalist in Moscow described it as living in two worlds simultaneously. In one, we are loyal Soviets. In the other, we are people who know too much. The state, aware of this tension, oscillated between openness and repression. Khrushchev allowed some cultural freedoms but banned others. He permitted the publication of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag story but suppressed Pasternak's novel. He rehabilitated some victims but refused to acknowledge the full scale of the terror. This inconsistency created frustration. A writer in Leningrad complained, "They give us truth in rations, as if we are children who cannot handle the full meal." For the families of victims, the pain was enduring. Even with rehabilitation, their loved ones were not coming back. The years lost to camps, the lives destroyed, the children who grew up fatherless, none of it could be undone. A woman whose husband died in Kolyma wrote, "They cleared his name, but they cannot clear my heart. I am 50 years old and I have spent 20 of them mourning a man they called a traitor. Now they say he was innocent. What do I do with this rage?" By the 1960s, the fervor of 1956 had cooled. The secret speech became a historical fact, referenced but not deeply examined. Stalin's image was removed from public squares, but the structure he built remained. The party adapted, survived, and continued. Yet the seeds of doubt planted in 1956 would grow slowly over decades.
The generation that heard Khrushchev's speech raised children who asked harder questions. Those children became the reformers of the 1980s, the ones who would push for glasnost and perestroika. In 1989, as the Soviet Union began to unravel, archives were opened more fully. Journalists published lists of the executed. Historians documented the camps. Television programs aired testimonies from survivors. The truth that had been whispered in 1956 was now shouted from every screen and newspaper. A historian in Moscow reflected, "Khrushchev's speech was the first crack in the wall. It took 30 years, but eventually the wall fell." In the end, the Soviet people's realization was not a single moment, but a slow, painful process. It began with a secret speech in a closed room. It spread through whispers and samizdat, through rehabilitations and returns. It lived in diaries, in kitchen conversations, in the quiet grief of those who finally knew the truth. They had believed in a lie, not because they were foolish, but because the lie was all-consuming. When it collapsed, it left a void. Some filled it with new beliefs. Others filled it with bitterness. But no one who lived through that realization could ever return to the certainty they once had. A teacher in Kyiv, writing in 1991 as the Soviet Union dissolved, captured it simply. "We were taught to worship a God who turned out to be a man, and not just any man, but one who built his throne on bones. Now we must learn to live in a world where gods do not exist, only people, flawed and mortal. It is terrifying, but it is also, finally, true."